Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and before I get to the wrap-up, I just wanted to mention, because I posted this over in the community tab, but I know not everyone can see that, the Classics and Company read-along/book club that On Novella and Micah Cummings run is reading Memoirs of Hadrian this month and a half really. I'm co-hosting with them for that, so if you would like to join in, I will put the Discord information in the link below, because that should be fun. With that, let's get on with the wrap-up. Once again, I'm kind of behind because the BookTube Prize stuff has taken over my reading and I lose track of things because I can't talk about that yet. But one of the things that I did do recently was I got caught up with some of the NetGalley advanced copies that I had. So I'm going to start with those. The silliest things that I read, actually I've got two that are pretty silly. But first I read Melani C's Milk and Mocha, Our Little Happiness. Milk and Mocha are two very cutesy bears who have a little pet dinosaur sidekick, and they're mostly a product. So there's something you see in stickers and keychains and emojis and things like that. And the artist who created them decided she would make a backstory so that the people who are fans can have a backstory. So this is a grouping of 4-panel comics. The advanced copy that I had was an electronic copy, but I believe the physical copy will have stickers, which I think people will love. Because this is the kind of thing that's adorable. I didn't actually like the backstory that the bears get. It's supposed to be their love story, but they seem kind of mean. But one of them seems kind of mean to the other, and it makes me feel sad for the other one. And I know it's not meant that way. That's just me being not very romantic. However, if you have friends who like these bears, who use the emojis when they're chatting with you, or who collect the keychains and the various products, this will be a great gift for them. So if somebody is sending you messages that have the Milk and Mocha bears in them, here's a gift idea. And, I mean, it's cute, but that is the best thing I can say about it. I didn't actually like the comics. The next thing that was kind of silly that I read was a Reductress book called How to Stay Productive When the World is Ending, which is a bit of a spoof on a productivity guide, except it's a bit much. Reductress is a satire website where essentially it's like fake news articles, and a satirical article is fine. A book of just sarcasm about useless advice, like useless investment advice for people who are never going to be able to afford houses, and people who are being overworked and all of that. Also, the world ending. So, I mean, it is what it says on the tin, but reading it straight through, it felt tedious because it's the same joke over and over. That said, though, I don't think this is meant to be read straight through. I think this is a joke. Again, if you have a friend who's very pessimistic about life, or who just is cynical about it, or makes snarky jokes about the end of the world and all of that, here you go. This is, again, a good gift. Kind of a gag gift, and a gift for somebody where you don't know what else to get them. That's what this is. I think it's funny for that. You flip through it. Maybe it's something you keep on your coffee table as a conversation piece. I think it works for that too. But reading it straight through, as I did so that I could write the review on NetGalley, probably not the best way to do that. So, you know, if you saw me list this on Goodreads, I gave it 3 stars, but I think it's probably successful at what it's trying to do. But what it's trying to do is pretty narrow and not really be read. So, you know, that just is what it is. I also finished reading a couple of review copies of poetry, one of which is kind of hard to talk about just because the formatting was terrible, and the final version may not be this bad. As everything with ebooks, and especially with poetry, often the lines will run into each other, and so hopefully for the final product that's not going to happen, but it makes it a little hard to review. So this is When the Night Agrees to Speak to Me by Ananda Devi, who's a Mauritian writer who has won all kinds of awards for French language poetry and writing. And this was translated by Karamali, who wrote Northern Lights, the memoir of living and growing up in northern Manitoba, which I talked about a year ago or 2 years ago. And the translation of this seems fine. The actual poetry collection is quite short, so the second half of this book is an interview that the translator is doing with the author. It also has translator's notes, there's some profiles, and that's all really interesting. The problem is, this does what I would like to see with translated books, is that it has both the original and the translation, but instead of having them on opposite pages, they're one on top of the other, basically. And so they run into each other in this ebook format. I assume the physical book won't be like that. I hope the final product that's not a review copy won't be like that in the ebook either. But formatting wise, it was almost unreadable in a couple of points. The parts that are more structured poetry still at least are just one and then the other, but there are sections that are almost prose poetry and those run into each other, and it's just a shame in terms of the formatting because it makes it hard to review because you just can't read it. But again, that is something that will probably not apply to the final product, so we will keep our fingers crossed for that. And then the last thing that I had to write a review for was Usman Hameedi's Staying Right Here, which is also a collection of poetry, all of which is autobiographical. It's mostly centered around being from New York City and growing up in New York City, and sort of the specifics of being a Pakistani American in a post 9/11 New York City, and being a New Yorker who later moves to Boston, and random family stories about an uncle's declining health and his father's garden, plus some social commentary. There's some great turns of phrase in the poetry, but what I thought was interesting about this is that I had the sense when I was reading it, because I ended up requesting this because I had seen a video on YouTube of the author reciting one of his poems, and I will link to that below. And if I had not seen that first, I would have been imagining a different rhythm to the poetry as I read it. And I think that's really interesting because it's not structured rhythmically as you read it, so I think there is a tendency to want to assign a rhythm to it when you're reading poetry, regardless of how it's structured. But the rhythm I would have assigned to it intuitively would not have been exactly what the author, I think, intended, because when he recites it, it takes a different rhythm. So that was interesting, just as a side thing. But yeah, I mean, I recommend listening to his poetry on YouTube if you come across it, which, as I said, you will, because I'll link it below. So that was the end of the things I was reviewing. Next up, I read some things that I actually owned. First up is another collection of poetry. This is Not Body by Tareq Bechelany-Lynch, whose poetry collection, The Good Arabs, I talked about last year or the year before. This, like that, is autobiographical poetry. That one was more generally about, I think, the author's experience of being a non-binary Lebanese Canadian living in Montreal. It was very Montreal. This is also, as I said, autobiographical, but is grappling significantly more with both health and kind of gender in a more central way, because the author is talking about how fibromyalgia diagnoses are tied to gender because it's considered a female disease, and how they, as a non-binary person with that diagnosis, now kind of grapple with the medical system, as well as kind of the generic, not generic, as well as talking more generally about the experience of living with chronic pain and the weird state of the pandemic world that we live in. So I think if you're interested in the idea, in the kind of subgenre of poetry on pain, this is an interesting addition to that. And also, as with anything that's an autobiographical work that follows a different autobiographical work, it kind of feels like you're catching up with the author. So next up, I read a romance novel, and that was Allyson Jeleyne's Their Haunted Nights. This is set in the late 1920s, but frankly, I feel like it should have been set earlier given the states of minds of the characters. Although it's part of a series, so I guess it had to be set at this point. So the two main characters are people who have been single for a long time. The man because he's getting over having lost his leg in the First World War, and the woman because she's getting over having lost her husband in the First World War. Hehowever, because it's 10 years later, it feels like there should be more made of the fact that they're stuck, and there really isn't. There's some vague stuff about how, he's been too caught up with his family's business, or how she's been doing charity work and growing into her, I guess not spinsterhood, young widowhood thing, and to the point that she's not young, because I think they're around 30 at that point. And I just felt, given their mental states, this could have been set 10 years earlier, and I was hoping that it wouldn't be, I don't know, people dealing with the fresh trauma of their backstories, because I find that less interesting, because that's so overdone within the genre. People are always, I'm helping you get over this stuff, and blah, I don't care. I don't need that. And that's what this is, and I feel like it shouldn't when it's set 10 years after they've experienced their trauma. I went into this expecting them to be in a different life stage, and they weren't. So that made me unhappy, but that is not necessarily a critique of the book, because, I mean, it kind of is, because I feel like it's, characterization-wise, there's stuff that's unanswered when that is happening, even though there is the backstory of he's helping with his family's business and she's doing charity work and blah, blah, blah. But I felt like the timing was off for this. But that could be just because I wanted it to go the other way. So, if this is the kind of trope that you like in your romance, and you want them to be, the couple to be helping each other get over trauma that's fresh in a way it shouldn't be after 10 years, but whatever, that's what this is. It was perfectly acceptable. Alright, next let's talk about some depressing stuff. And next up I read Alex Laguma's A Walk in the Night and Other Stories. This is a novella, which is where the title comes from, followed by a few short stories. And the stories in here were written in the 60s, and are focused primarily on characters who are Cape-colored or who would be lumped in that kind of in-between category under the apartheid system. And the first story we follow a couple of young guys who are making the worst of several bad choices. So their situation is awful and they don't have a lot of opportunities, but when opportunities to do something slightly less awful emerge, they don't usually pick that kind of thing. So it is incredibly grim, and the setting itself is grim, and there's police brutality, and then also just random people slapping each other and accidentally murdering people, which I guess is manslaughter if you're accidentally doing it. So it's very bleak. The short stories then later on are a little bit lighter, not necessarily in terms of content, because a lot of it is depressing. Like there's one story, for example, where some characters in prison are talking to each other, and it's funny because it ends on this cliffhanger where it could go either way, but either way is going to be depressing in a way that's almost like, oh no. There's another story that's set in a bar, and there are some American sailors who are in there, and there's some kind of funny commentary about how the racial categories in South Africa and in the United States don't necessarily line up with each other and all of that. So yeah, it's an interesting piece of history. It does feel very 1960s, both in terms of things like the swearing is starred out, but also in terms of the attitudes, and in terms of reading this now, you know how political changes happen, and you also know how different international relations work, like especially the story with the sailors, and you think it doesn't play out the way I think people would think about it playing out now, just because I think there's more connection between the world in parts. Although as I'm saying that, I'm thinking about, oh, who's that South African actress who had people in the US telling her she wasn't allowed to call herself colored anymore, because in the US that's, you know, it's not a neutral label, but she's like, but she's not in the US, so, oh, I'm blanking on her name. She was in Lucifer and Spartacus. Anyway, does that matter? Not really. But one of the stories in here did make me think of that, because that's a conversation that I guess they wouldn't have had in the 60s, because the way the US language has changed since then is different from, yeah. Anyway, it's worth reading if you come across, but I think as much as a kind of window on a moment in history as because it's good on its own. Although, and again, that said, this felt like the kind of book that needed to have either a big introduction or an afterword explaining more, that had more context around the author's life, because afterwards I went and, you know, read stuff about him on Wikipedia, and I think that would have been useful context going in. So I would like to see an edition of that includes some of that, because I went and looked it up afterwards, but it would have been fun to read it in advance. Although I know a lot of people don't read that kind of introduction or afterword at all, or save it for afterwards, so maybe it wouldn't matter. And finally, I read what is a young adult novel, although it feels more like a book club, I guess chick lit type crossover book. As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zoulfa Katouh. And if you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen me call this a war story for people who don't like war stories. This is written in a very engaging style. We're following this girl in her late teens who was in pharmacy school, and when the war/revolution in Syria broke out, she ended up being in an area that's under siege, and she's volunteering at a hospital where she's basically been turned into a nurse because there were so few medical professionals who were left in the area. And she is dealing with a lot of major PTSD. She's seeing things, and she's also trying to make a plan to escape to Germany. She also, because this is a young adult novel at its core, runs into a boy of her age who turns out to be the person that, had the war/revolution not started, her mother would have set her up with. So I thought that was kind of a cute way to introduce a romance in a situation where the characters are fairly religious, so you know, you figured they would want to have chaperones normally, but by having it be the person that their parents would have set them up with, were their parents still alive, keeps it on the up and up a bit, I guess. I feel silly describing that part of the plot because so much of the rest of this is very serious. The love interest wants to stay in Syria but also wants to get his younger siblings out, so there's all of this drama, worrying about people drowning in the Mediterranean and people getting shot by snipers all the time, and everyone's family has been half wiped out. But then you also have this very structured young adult romance running through it that carries through it. And I think the juxtaposition of those two things is what gives it the crossover, because I think a lot of book club type reads are the let's talk about the issues that were introduced here, and it certainly works for that. I would rather see people read something like Khalid Khalifa's Death is Hard Work, translated by Larry Price, but I know a lot of people will find this to be way too bleak or don't read translated fiction. I mean, there are so many memoirs from Syria that people could be reading, but there are people who don't read nonfiction, and I think this is the kind of book that has the crossover appeal, and people who are not paying attention to the news and don't know what's been happening in Syria for the past 10 years may pick this up. Some of the timeline stuff is not quite right. It's compressed, but the author talks about that in the notes, and, you know, I think it does what it's supposed to do. I think in the notes the author says that when she was studying in Switzerland, she would have people say, so what even was happening in Syria these days? And this book is sort of an answer to that, as well as being a book you can read with your book club that is also appropriate for a younger audience and shouldn't offend too many religious people. So it ticks a lot of boxes there. I think it's successful at what it does, which is being a war story for people who don't normally read war stories. So there you go. Anyway, that has been my recent reading. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.